Marriage and Missions. We're talking with families who have used the influence of their marriage to support the mission efforts of their local church. That's up next on this episode of the Healing Place Marriage and Family Podcast.
Welcome to the Healing Place Marriage and Family Podcast, where families are equipped to reflect God's redeeming love. And now, here's your host, Jared Lambert.
All right, welcome everybody to the Healing Place Marriage and Family Podcast, where families are equipped to reflect God's redeeming love. I'm your host, Jared Lambert. Thank you for taking time to join us and download and checking out the podcast. We are in the middle of a new series for the start of 2018 called Marriage and Missions, and we're talking with married couples both in the United States and in Honduras. We just wanted to hear the hearts of couples and marriages who have a heart for missions and how they leverage the influence of their marriage to support the efforts of the missions of the Church of Jesus Christ. So joining us this episode is Pat and Leah Conti. Pat, Leah, how you guys doing this evening?
Doing well. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're excited to be here.
Pat and Leah are based in Baton Rouge. They're longtime members of Healing Place Church. I want to start off by just letting them give us a brief introductory to their family. So tell us a little bit about the Contis.
All right, Leah, you want to take this one?
So I was born and raised here in Baton Rouge, and I started going to Healing Place when I was about 12 years old. And it's where I came to know the Lord. It's where I was really raised spiritually, and I consider myself a daughter of this church and this house, and am proud to be. When I was in middle school, I was a volunteer junior leader with the Vacation Bible School one summer. And I was slowly getting to know the Lord over this period. And one of the things that we used to do with the Vacation Bible School was that throughout the week, we would raise money for Children's Cup, which is a nonprofit that Healing Place has supported throughout the years. And this year, Brother Dave and Miss Jean Oler-King, who are the founders of Children's Cup, would come and share about what Children's Cup was about and about the heart and what they were doing in Swaziland and in Southern Africa. And as Mr. Dave stood on stage and shared about what Children's Cup was doing, he started to cry, and he also invited the children that were part of Vacation Bible School to be missionaries. He said, "Who of you will go?" He really believed in calling children when they were young and the power of that and the validity of that. And so I remember in that moment, a seed was planted in my heart for missions, for Africa, for what God was doing around the world. And that took root and grew. And I, got involved in the church throughout high school and college and became a leader. Then I did School of Ministry after college, and then came on staff. And I worked at Healing Place for a few years, during which Patrick and I met, and I'll let him share his story a little bit. And we got married and continued to work on staff there until we really felt like God was calling us to go ourselves. And we moved to South Africa, and we'll pick up that story after Pat shares his piece.
Yeah.
So my story is a little bit different in that I actually grew up overseas. My dad was involved in international business, and we lived in Belgium and then in Singapore. And one of my best friends actually growing up, he was a missionary kid. His dad was a pastor there in Singapore. And I think being overseas, I always had a tendency and a love for that, being overseas and interacting with different cultures. And I can very easily interact with someone from an Asian culture and someone from a European culture and an African culture. And so I love the intercultural relationships. And we moved back to the States, and I got involved at Healing Place briefly when I was in high school. We moved to Baton Rouge when I was a freshman. I was a big soccer player and actually didn't go to church that much because we were always gone on weekends. But I got involved in Healing Place a little bit, but it was really my brother. He actually is the video editor. Now he's the director of, I don't know what they call it, the creative team at HBC. And kind of all the creative elements in service and production and those type of things. And, my mom and him got really connected to the HBC family while I was off at college. And then after college, I was looking to do something internationally, and God was kind of challenging me on that. Well, if you're going to do something internationally, why don't you do something for me? And so then I started looking at Christian organizations to go on mission with, or do a year abroad or something like that. And I met with Dave and Jean Olerking, who Leah referenced earlier, the founders of Children's Cup. And they asked me to come be their first, missionary outside of family. And it was scary because it was the most expensive, and it was I wouldn't be on a team or anything like that in terms of other people my age. I was just going to join Ben and Susan Rogers, who were the only missionaries on the ground at that time. And so after much back and forth, I felt like that was the one that God was leading me to. And 1 year turned into 4 years, and the story goes on from there. But missions was in my blood, and doing something of significance and being on missions is really something I feel called to, and that makes me come alive.
Absolutely. Yeah. Dave and Jean Olerking, anytime I get a chance to talk about them, I just say that they were one of the earliest influences on Brandy and I's life. Well, when we first started attending Healing Place right around 2000, 2001, to hear, like you said, to hear him speak, man, he hit the passion and the love he has for the continent of Africa is contagious. And it was Dave and Jean Olerking, and it was Children's Cups that really stirred up something in Brandy and I's heart. So, all right. So you guys were pretty much called to missions before meeting and before getting married. So when you guys were praying about a spouse, or even when you guys started talking and dating, how important was it that your potential spouse had a heart for the mission field?
I guess I can start with this one. For me, it was important because I was overseas. I was over in Swaziland in Southern Africa, and I had been around a lot of missionaries and heard a lot of stories about people that, they had a heart for missions, but then they got married to someone who didn't have that same heart, and how that kind of caused them either to give up the mission field or to drift apart in their marriage. And so for me, I had always heard that. And so that was definitely something I was looking for when I was starting to pray about and seek after a wife.
Yeah, I mean, it was something that I had become so deeply passionate about. It's what I went to college for. I'm a pretty headstrong person, and it's like that was what my goal was set on. And so I knew that whoever I was going to marry would have to be on the same page. It wasn't something I don't think I'd even consider like an option B for.
Right. Yeah.
At that point. Yeah.
And when that when you're called to something, if you take your time and you do it prayerfully and you're led by the Holy Spirit, your spouse is going to have that same heart. God's going to knit your hearts together. So
yeah, I believe that. Yeah.
Go ahead.
If I can add one thing to that, it's just that I remember hearing, I think it was maybe Brother Dave and Miss Jean together share on the same thing, that if you're called and you're married, you're both called. One spouse isn't called to missions and the other not, because the way that God puts our story together, like if that's what he's called, created us to do, then, and he's created us for this spouse, then he's going to have to work it out in their hearts. And there's so many stories of people who one spouse feels that, calling first, and it's years and years, 10, 15 years before the other does. And, it always plays out differently, but for us, that's kind of how it looks.
And how long you guys been married?
5.5 years. Almost.
It's been a wild ride.
And to take it even one step further from what Leah's saying about, if you're called, your spouse will be called. What we've discovered in just our short time here in Honduras is that if you're called as husband and wife, your children are going to be called also. We've been, pleasantly, not surprised, but just really amazed and blessed about how our two kids, Jada, 12 years old, Josiah, 8 years old, are just blending in so well, and they're really not fighting. They're finding their place. They're enjoying things. They're enjoying the other kids. They're enjoying, the community and the culture. So if God calls families fathers, mothers, and
Yep.
children also. So that's encouraging.
Yes.
All right, so 5.5
Yeah.
years of being married. When you guys look back on those 5.5 years, how would you say that missions has impacted your marriage?
In a lot of ways. Lee, what
I
are
would
your
just say,
thoughts?
like, our marriage has been built around missions. I mean, we started, obviously, like Patrick shared, with like, this is kind of the direction we're going. And we knew what we were getting ourselves into when we said, I do, On our wedding day, it actually, it rained and we got married outdoors
poured,
in
Leah.
August. It poured.
Rain is a gentle, kind word. There's a lot more
We were
descriptive words.
married. Yeah. We got married in the pouring rain in Louisiana.
And the
in
cool thing
August,
about it was
outside.
everybody just went along with it.
They sure did.
Yeah.
But you know what? And I think I'm Ben Rogers, who is the executive director of Children's Cup, he officiated part of our wedding. And he was like, this is a perfect picture for what marriage looks like. You don't always get the circumstances that you think. And sometimes, you're letting the mud squish between your toes and it's hard and it's not what you planned for, but you roll with it and you make the most of it. And I feel like that was the best figurative. I'm a very metaphorical person, beginning way to start a marriage with like what we have even, only 5 years in walked through in regards to missions. Because we got married. We thought we would live in America for a little while. And a year and a half later, we were fundraising. No, a year and a half later, we were on the field.
Yeah. A year later, God said, go.
Right. So a year after getting married, we listed our house that we had bought for sale. We owned it for a year. And we listed it for sale. We sold everything, packed up what we could. And a year and a half later, we were in South Africa. We lived in South Africa for a year and a half. God said, go to Tanzania, which is in Eastern Africa. We moved there, 7 weeks pregnant. Lived there for a year and a half, had our son in South Africa while we were living in Tanzania. And so I feel like our entire marriage has been built around the momentum of being a part of missions. It's all the only context in which we really know our marriage is in that world.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say, I don't know if this is jumping ahead or not, but marriage and missions, I think there's a lot of teamwork that's involved. Not to say that everyday marriage doesn't have that, but I think when you're thrown into a missions context, there's such a need for teamwork. And I think that's something that we've learned. We've learned how to work together. We've learned how to be friends together. We've learned how to do all areas of life together. Whereas, for some people, not everyone, but you're here in Louisiana or wherever you're based, and you go to work and your spouse goes to work and then you meet up at the end of the day. But it's, whereas missions is kind of like marriage, missions, family life, work, it's all kind of together. So I think we've learned how to be a good team and how to, kind of work together as a team. But then also the tricky part is also balancing of, okay, we're not just a team, but we're a married couple too.
Yeah.
And I don't think we have that 100% figured out, but there's definitely a balance there and a tension there.
Well, I was going to add something there. I was just going to say as well that on what Pat was saying, that one of the cool blessings of doing missions and having a marriage, and Jared, I feel like you could probably attest to this, even only being a few months in to being there in Honduras, is that when you're in your regular world and the culture that you come from, wherever it is, there's rather a regular pace and rhythm to life and how marriage is supposed to look and how your life and your family looks. And when you're plucked out of that and to put somewhere else that's unfamiliar, really, and your spouses and your family is your only sense of familiarity. So everything else is kind of foreign and you're what's known. And it really makes you, it hopefully would make you to build the foundation of that stronger and to rely on each other in a different way than I think we're not forced to do that when you live in the same culture that you come from. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And also just to add on that, to define who you are and who you want to be as a family. Whereas, sometimes you can just drift along and be like, hey, we but like when you're in that new context and when you're building new friendships and you're, relating to a different culture, you're like, well, what is our family culture?
Right. That's awesome.
Might be the same question, but let me ask this. You kind of touched on it, but I think we can dig a little deeper. So we talked about how has missions impacted your marriage. So how would you say that you've used your marriage to impact missions?
I think one of the things is our marriage, and it's kind of more subtle, but I think it's been an example of some of that kingdom culture. Not the American culture. We try not to, but like in exemplifying, like, how am I supposed to treat my wife? I'm supposed to love her. I'm supposed to meet her needs, and value her and respect her. And some of that has just been an example, whether it's been a 16, 17-year-old boy that, we helped out and had stayed in our house when we were overseas in South Africa and Swaziland, even to some of the pastors that we work with, because everyone's coming at it from a different cultural angle. So a South African pastor or Ugandan pastor, Tanzanian pastor, they know the word of God, but they also have their cultural things that they grew up with. And so trying for our marriage and how I treated Leah and how I walked out my marriage to be an example of, like, I'm trying to follow what the Bible says. Ephesians, I think it says, how to treat your wife. Live that out and be an example to some of the guys that we were working with and to some of the people that we were ministering to. That would be my way of saying it. How our marriage specifically impacted missions. I can say for Leah, like, we were able to host a lot of people in our home. And obviously as a single dude, when I was on the mission field, I couldn't really do that to the same effect or same level and didn't create that space for people. And so, like, our marriage together, being a team, we were able to do that and bring refreshment and encouragement to a lot of people.
Looking back on your time in Africa, and what you guys are working on now, what are some of the big lessons that was learned? What are some of the experience that have kind of refined your hearts and have really challenged you guys to reflect God's redeeming love to each other?
Lessons learned, I think it's just in general, the enemy likes to divide, and you see an attack on marriages no matter where you are in the world. And I definitely think missionaries, obviously, that is an area that we saw, the enemy come and drop in strife and division and those type of things and try and cause people to kind of drift apart in their marriages. And like you said, Jared, earlier, there is a lot of pressure that the mission field puts on, when you're in ministry and you're in your ministry together and you're in a different country and you don't have your support system that you normally have. It puts a lot of pressure on that relationship. And we've seen that. And we have a real heart to help people navigate that. Not that we have it figured out, but we have a heart to help missionaries and those in ministry and those type of people to really learn how to have healthy marriages and have healthy relationships, and what are some ways that God wants them to live, organize their life, blah, 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 to be healthy. And so we have a passion to see health because we've seen that's an area the enemy goes after.
Yeah. Here's the thing, I think, is that when you're living in a context that's unfamiliar, in something like an admission scenario, wherever in the world that is, you're going to have this extra pressure, like Patrick was saying, like we've talked about already. And the enemy will use that to wiggle his way in. And a lot of times it takes its toll on marriages and families. And we've seen it time and time again, and I think when you're living somewhere, especially where you're surrounded by needs, and you're surrounded by physical needs, it's just very evident. And there's this pressure as someone who's there as a missionary, as someone who's there to do God's work. You feel a pressure. It's not necessarily the correct pressure. And hopefully if you create healthy boundaries, you won't stay there, but to meet the needs, because you see all these needs, you see all these people who are hurting, these people who need light, they need truth, they need, food, they need clothes, like all the things. And so you feel this pressure to meet it. And a lot of times that can weigh on you when you're at work. It can weigh on you when you're at home. It weighs on your family. It can weigh on your kids, on your marriage. And so we've just seen the weight of that, take people down in so many different ways. And so that is like what Pat was saying of why we see the importance of health and creating these healthy boundaries around marriages and families and around your own soul as well. Because if individuals aren't healthy, then marriages aren't healthy either,
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the lessons learned per se is that we recognize, and one of the reasons we felt like we needed to come home from Tanzania is that we were really struggling to find spiritual community. Yeah. So we knew a lot of missionaries, we knew a lot of Tanzanian pastors, but we just never found the place that God was going to surround us with with spiritual community. And there's something about that is important, like a lesson learned, like a tip, I guess, if you're going into missions, is to try and find who and how is your spiritual community going to be. If you're going as a church planter, well, you might not have a church that surrounds you, but maybe you can have a couple or a neighboring church or a group of missionaries that can pour into you, that you can have real conversations with and be like, hey, I'm struggling, or hey, Leah and I are disagreeing about this. Can you pray for me, man? Finding that is important. And when it's in place, I feel like you can have a healthy marriage and do missions well. When you don't have that in place, you got to get creative. And if it's ultimately you can't do it, then you're not going to be healthy. And so what you're pouring out to the people is not going to be healthy.
If I could add on to that, is that, we didn't have the spiritual community like Pat was saying. And we moved to Tanzania and I was 7 weeks pregnant. So I was pregnant there. It was a very difficult move for us. We didn't have any of our belongings for 11 months. We lived in it was a different, setting, different climate. It was hot. Did I mention I was pregnant? And so whenever I got home, I was going through some postpartum depression after having my son, more anxiety. And we didn't have that spiritual community. And the weight of that and the brunt of that really did weigh on our marriage. And so it was like a hard struggle for us to walk through that together, because I didn't really have anyone else other than Patrick to turn to. We had a few people, but it just wasn't the level of community maybe that we were used to. And so, just to reiterate the importance of that and give a real life example of what that looked like for us.
I can understand how the lack of that community, and with all the things that you guys were going through, how that did put you guys in a tough spot. But again, as believers, one thing we're promised while on this earth is the presence of suffering. And it's not the suffering that causes, that destroys us. It's the suffering where the old man, the dead man, the flesh in us is getting squeezed so that God can put that dead man to death so that we can walk more in his spirit and become more like him. And, there's no doubt in my mind that whatever you guys went through, was just God's way of putting you guys in the crucible in order to purify your hearts individually, and also to purify, your marriage and what he has for you guys in the next season of your lives. So, all right. So on that note, you guys have entered a new season. You're back in Baton Rouge, and God has given you guys a small glimpse of the next season of ministry for you guys. So why don't you guys talk about that a little bit?
Like I said, we were living in Tanzania for a year and a half. We came back last Christmas. We had our son overseas. None of our family had met him other than my mom. So we came back to visit last Christmas just for a short time. And while we were here, leading up to our trip back, we had kind of felt the Lord begin to show us why he called us to Tanzania. We'd been there a little over a year with absolutely no idea why, other than he said to go to this certain small town at the base of Mount Kilimanjaro. And so we started to get the vision of kind of like how he'd wired us. And I think that's why he brought us there. A real quick side note is that before we ever moved overseas, I had a meeting with a dear friend and sister named Jackie Bickford. I had a conversation with her, and she's so sweet and patient with me. And she said, Leah, what if the only reason God is bringing you to Africa is so that he can work on you? And I probably rolled my eyes at her. And I was like, that's sweet, Jackie. That's a waste of everyone's time and money. And she said, okay, that's good. Obviously, like, just wait and see. Come to find out, the only reason God does anything is because he wants us to know him more.
Yeah.
And he's not really that concerned about what we can do to perform for him. And so I think the whole reason he brought us to Tanzania was to refine, like you said, to refine things within us. And I think he wanted to show us this vision. And we were discovering how we're wired and how we're built and how we can best serve the kingdom of God. And we had this idea for this organization. All of that to say, we were back in the States. We were preparing to go back to Tanzania to start the organization and kind of give it some trial runs. And we felt like God said, it's time to come home. We felt like we needed to come back so that we ourselves could be strengthened. And so the organization that we've been in the process of starting, is called Juniper Table. And the purpose of this organization is to create opportunities that strengthen hungry leaders to do effective ministry. And I'll let Pat explain a little bit more of that.
Yeah, so Juniper Table, the idea behind it is setting the table for opportunities to strengthen hungry leaders. And the Juniper part, it comes from
1 Kings 19.
1 Kings, where Elijah had this amazing duel with the prophets of Baal, and he calls down fire, and he kind of shows them, look, my God is the only God, and has this huge spiritual victory. And then a few scenes later, he's running out into the desert and totally discouraged, depressed. And he even says, Lord, take me now, basically, take my life, I'm done. And he falls under the juniper tree. And that's where the angel of the Lord meets him and first gives him food, meets his physical needs, then kind of meets his emotional needs, like, no, it's going to be okay. And then sends him off to Sinai, to the mountain. And that's where he hears the voice of the Lord and kind of has a spiritual encounter. And that just resonated with us because we saw that so much in missionaries and even in the local African pastors that we were working with. A need, you do some great things and you have some great victories, but then a week later, 3 months later, you're ready to give it all up. And so Juniper Table is setting the table for opportunities where Juniper moments can happen. And the way that we see that happening is through bringing refreshment and encouragement to those type of people. And then a second thing is also bringing strategy. The angel of the Lord, I think it was after Sinai, God tells Elijah what to do next. And not that we want to tell people what to do, but we want to help them with their strategy, because a lot of missionaries, local pastors, they have no one to bounce ideas off of. They have no one that really understands their world. And so we want to be people that can go in, hear their story, and then help them to strategize and dig out what's in their own heart and what God's put in their heart, and create a clear vision so that they can continue to run forward and have continue that momentum and be effective going forward. So those are kind of the two main thrusts. We also want to help with some communication and different things like that, but really support and strengthen those leaders who are hungry for input. If there's plenty of missionaries maybe that don't want the input, and we don't, that's not our place. But so we're in the midst. We've registered this nonprofit, but we're still seeking God for what it really needs to look like. And okay, you want to bring refreshment practically. What does that need to look like? And still in that kind of prayerful stage of like, God, what does this really need to look like? And how do you want us to carry this forward? But also being willing to pause and let him work and strengthen us, like Leah was saying. That's our heart. We see, like you said, so many people, it's not some miraculous thing, but it is. It's like the keys to their heart, reminding people of the Word of God, reminding them of the promises that God's made over their life. And you see so much great momentum, whether it's a church plant in the States, whether it's a nonprofit that launches here in the States, whether it's a missionary overseas. Absolutely. You see all these people start.
Yeah.
And we just want to make sure that they keep going with what God's called them to do and not give up before it's time. Mm-hmm. And so we really have a heart for that. And, obviously feel like God's training and equipping us. And like you said, he's not going to waste anything. So some of the things that we faced, even in coming home and transitioning home, like right now, trying to figure out a new life back here in America, it's stuff that missionaries face all the time. And so we have to walk it out before we're able to minister to it.
Right. So tell us about how we can follow you guys and learn more about Juniper Table.
We are still working on the big website. If they want to, know more about what Juniper Table is about and what we're doing, or if they have any great ideas of how we can encourage missionaries or people in ministry or in the nonprofit world, we would love to hear those. They can visit www.junipertable.org.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Once again, that's www.junipertable.org. All right, Pat and Leah, thank you guys for joining us. So encouraging to hear your story, and we're excited about the future of you guys and Juniper Table. Looking forward to catching up with you down the road to see exactly what God does through your ministry. All right, so for everyone listening, as always, we encourage you to subscribe to the podcast and share the podcast with your family and friends. Also, if you could take time to rate the podcast and write a review, what that does is gives us an opportunity to know how to serve you better. All right, we're excited about the series, looking forward to speaking with more families and more marriages who are using the influence of their marriage to impact the missions work in their local church. That'll do it for this episode. Please join us next time on the Healing Place Marriage and Family Podcast.
Thank you for joining us for today's podcast. For more information about Healing Place Church, visit us at healingplacechurch.org. For more podcast episodes, subscribe to the Healing Place Marriage and Family Podcast on iTunes or the podcast server for your device.